Hi Samuel. Gonna make a response to your video why I think EA will, or why I think ID will never be bought out by EA. ID Software is unique amongst most developers and publishers. Um, First off, they're the only company I know of that consistently releases Linux clients, like you say. Um, One example I point to constantly is Quake Wars, which is somewhat of a current gen game. I don't know how current it is, um, but it's basically everyone talks about Team Fortress 2 all the time, and it's basically the same team-based game as that, same kind of team-based multiplayer. But you're not required to install some obtrusive software like Steam with it. Uh, every other comparable company which continues to support the PC platform, like Valve, um, requires some kind of DRM to be installed, and that's what Steam is. Steam is DRM. Whether you want to, get around some kind of weird definition of DRM, it requires they require you to install it for, even offline games like Half-Life 2 and Portal. Games that are completely single player. You still have to install Steam and, get all the Steam patches and load Steam up before you can even play any one of their games. But ID Software does not require anything like this, and I don't think they ever will. Now, that's not to say that I think that they'll be in business forever. This is the problem I see with things like Steam and other types of DRM, which require the game to phone home, so to speak, which require the game to call the software company's servers and verify or validate themselves. This is why I avoid DRM, and this is why I don't like where PC gaming is going, and why I stick to indie games. ID Software, though, is a big exception amongst the bigger companies. I mean, of course, they made the old Doom and Wolfenstein, and they've been around for years. It's almost surprising they're still in business sometimes, but the reason they're still in business is because they do things right, like I said. Enemy Territory was a game, the first Enemy Territory, that they released the source code to very soon after they came out with it. I guess it might not have been selling well or whatever. I'm not sure why, but they just basically released the source code and then released the game for free, which allowed all kinds of mods and maps. And I mean, if you look at it, it's still, even though there's a sequel released that's been out for about a year or two, there's still a big community for the first game, a big modding community around the first game. Now, the graphics aren't impressive; they're nothing to phone home about. But it's an example of the fact that they're not, once something's had its life cycle with them, they don't, hang on to it like all these companies that are letting everything abandon. And letting they'd rather hold on to the license until the game dies, until it goes into abandonment. And you get this abandonware. ID lets the source code out, and before that happens, usually look at the Quake 3 engine. I mean, and look at how many mods there are for the Quake 3 engine. World of Padman comes to mind, and I mean, these are standalone modifications to a game. So I always say that ID is one of the few companies worth supporting, and I'm more than willing to buy any version of or any game that ID comes out with, because they always do the right thing, and they always release Linux clients. There's Linux clients for Quake Wars, for Quake 4, for Doom 3, and all the Quake games, as far as I know. Yeah, all the way back to 1, Quake 1. But it's not just their support of Linux, although that goes a long way with someone like me. I'm sure it goes a long way with you too. And that was why I refused to support Valve for the longest time, was because they absolutely refuse to support Linux. And yet, here's a company which has no problem doing it. Now, I mean, you can get into a big, OpenGL versus DirectX debate there. But a lot of companies program in OpenGL and then switch to DirectX for the final game. And I don't understand why they can make, and all they do is come out with, an installer that just moves the map files, that just installs the map files on the hard drive. I don't see why that's so hard. And to make a launcher for Linux, because nobody can do it because the game's not open source. Instead, these companies like Valve, EA, others force you to use Wine. They force you to use Wine because that's what they tell you to do. They say, "Oh, it'll run on Linux. All you have to do is use Wine." Well, that's not really running on Linux. That's not running natively. And there's a lot of problems with Wine, especially when you're running a big game that requires a lot of stuff. If you're running something small, that's fine. But these are big, complicated games that are pretty demanding on resources. Wine can't always handle that. I switched back over to Windows because I couldn't get the games I wanted to play on Wine to work. And the ID is another example I point to of how piracy hasn't killed PC gaming. That's it's a common argument that's given, but I think it's misinformed, because piracy has been around since the beginning of PC gaming. Since games were first put on computers, there's been piracy, and yet it's only recently, within the past year or two, that companies have really big time dropped their support for it. Or if they do come out with a game on PC, it's usually a port from the console, which is so backwards. That's so not the way it used to be. I can remember growing up, I was always a console gamer up until a few years ago. And I, getting just completely looked down, aside from getting completely looked down on by PC gamers, is, oh, well, that's not really gaming or whatever. When they didn't know about games like, the Final Fantasy series and others that were in depth and had, something that wasn't on PCs at the time. There were a lot of games that were on PC that just couldn't be put on consoles. The old LucasArts adventure games come to mind. Games like the old Command and Conquers and Civilizations, and there were ports. They tried to port them over, but they were terrible. They were nothing like the PC versions. They didn't work nearly as well or have as much you couldn't interface with them nearly as well, and usually there was a graphical cost. I'm just really disappointed by now that I'm trying to go and play these PC games, that all these companies are snubbing the PC now, whereas then they supported it for so long. And it's not because of piracy. Piracy's been around since computers have been around. It's because of DRM. As long as these companies continue to put this intrusive software on with their games, these rootkits, the secure ROM, all of this stuff. I'm not talking about CD keys. CD keys is one thing. But to put a rootkit on an installer and not even tell the customer that it's installing, that's wrong. And I'm not going to support that, and I don't think anybody else should either.